The smoke rising from Carthage was not the smoke of hearth fires or temple incense. It was the smoke of bargaining, a city negotiating with its gods using human breath as currency. On the high terraces overlooking the sea, where wealth arrived on ships and power was measured in silver and fear, a different kind of procession climbed toward the Tophet. The crowd did not come to celebrate a victory. They came to watch a promise being paid. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. If you enjoy history told without the perfume, like, subscribe, and ring the bell now, because this story lives in the space where religion, politics, and terror overlap. Tonight we walk into Carthage, not as tourists admiring ruins, but as witnesses following the smell of ash through a city that Rome feared enough to erase. Carthage was once one of the richest powers on earth, a maritime empire built on trade routes, treaties, and war. Its harbors were engineering miracles, its merchants spoke in the language of profit, and its diplomats could turn a handshake into surrender. But beneath that polished surface ran a darker system of control. In Carthage, devotion could become spectacle. Labor could become captivity. Punishment could become theater. And in moments of crisis, when the sea turned against them, or enemies pressed in the city, sometimes reached for the most extreme offering, a society can imagine the lives of its own children burned not as murder for pleasure, but as sacrifice for survival. Ancient writers described a bronze figure associated with Baal-Hamon, whom Greeks and Romans sometimes equated with Kronos. The image was said to receive the offering on outstretched hands, angled downward so the body rolled toward the fire below. Whether every detail is literal or shaped by hostile retelling, the core idea remains: there was a place in Carthage where the boundary between worship and killing could collapse, and that place left ash in the ground for centuries. The question that haunts us is not only what happened there, but why a civilization sophisticated enough to dominate the Mediterranean could also choose to speak to heaven in the language of flame. The Tophet was not a battlefield. That is what makes it so unsettling. Battles kill because the enemy stands in the way. The Tophet, if the darkest accounts are even partly true, killed because the city believed the gods demanded payment. Ancient sources describe music used as a curtain of sound. Plutarch wrote that drums and flutes were played to drown out cries, and that mourners were expected to perform composure as part of the ritual. The point was not silence. The point was control. If the crowd heard the screams too clearly, the city might hear its own conscience. Then there are the stones. Carthaginian stelae found in the Tophet include dedications to Tanit and Baal-Hamon. Some inscriptions use language that reads like a vow fulfilled, sometimes translated as an offering of flesh. The wording is brief, formal, and cold. The way a contract becomes cold when it has been repeated so often it turns into routine. These stelae are one reason the debate will never fully disappear, because they come from Carthage itself, not from Roman enemies writing propaganda after the fact. And beneath those stones, archaeologists found urns. Thousands of them. Many contain the burned remains of very young children, sometimes mixed with small animals. This evidence sits at the center of the argument: were these always sacrifices, or were some burials of infants who died naturally, then consecrated to the gods in death? Some scholars argue the Tophet functioned partly as a cemetery for infants who did not survive birth or early life in a world where infant mortality was tragically common. Others argue that the quantity, the burning, and the ritual context point to systematic sacrifice, at least some of the time, especially in periods of crisis. For us, the most honest approach is to hold both realities at once. Carthage may have been a city where many infants died of disease and poverty like everywhere else in antiquity, and also a city where at times leaders chose to transform grief into ritual killing to prove loyalty to gods and state. Even the possibility of that choice changes the way we see Carthage's power. It suggests a civilization that understood fear as a tool so well it could aim it upward toward heaven and downward toward its own people. Whether sacrifice was constant or crisis-driven, the rumor of it became a weapon. Enemies listened to the stories and heard a message. If Carthage could do this to its own children, what might it do to conquered strangers? Fear travels faster than ships. It spreads before an army arrives. It makes walls feel thinner. It makes surrender feel rational. And Carthage did not rely on one kind of power. It was not only a city of priests. It was also a city of accountants and shipbuilders, a commercial machine fueled by labor that often was not free. The harbors of Carthage, especially the famous military harbor with its circular design, represented a state built for maritime dominance. Ships needed timber, rope, pitch, nails, cloth for sails, and endless hands to carry cut, stitch, and hammer. Those hands frequently belonged to the conquered. Slavery in Carthage was not an accident. It was structural. Captives from Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, and North Africa could be sold, worked, rented out, or assigned to state projects. In a world without industrial engines, the human body was the engine. And in Carthage, that engine was often chained. The galley rower, the quarry worker, the field hand, the workshop grinder, the porter on the docks, these people formed the invisible infrastructure beneath the city's wealth. Imagine the shipyards at dawn. The sea smells clean, but the docks do not. Tar and fish, sweat and old blood. "Orders!" shouted in Punic. A whip cracking, not because the work is slow, but because cruelty teaches obedience faster than instruction. The empire's strength rested on speed and supply. If the harbor could launch ships quickly, Carthage could choke trade ferry troops and punish rebellion. That speed required a workforce that could be consumed without political consequence. Citizens could protest. Slaves could not. That is the brutal logic of empires built on captivity. Carthage's agricultural wealth, too, leaned on forced labor. Ancient writers preserved the reputation of Mago, a Carthaginian author, whose writings on farming were valued enough that Romans reportedly preserved and translated them after Carthage fell. A treatise on agriculture sounds harmless until you remember what agriculture meant in antiquity: vast estates, tight schedules, constant risk, and bodies that could be replaced. Managing a farm was often managing people as tools, measuring output in grain and endurance in pain. Women and children were not spared the system. They worked in households and workshops, grinding grain, carrying water, hauling clay, spinning wool, cleaning, cooking, and serving. Children born into slavery grew up inside the economy like bricks built into a wall. Their lives were not interrupted by captivity. Their lives began with it. And foreign captives had another role. They reminded citizens what happened to those on the wrong side of Carthage's power. When rebellion flared, the state answered with demonstration. Carthage's wars created prisoners, but its internal conflicts created something worse: enemies, who once served the state, who knew its weakness, who had been promised money and received betrayal. After the First Punic War, Carthage faced the Mercenary War, a brutal uprising of unpaid soldiers and desperate allies. In that conflict, cruelty became reciprocal, escalating until both sides treated the other as less than human. Ancient accounts describe grotesque punishments and retaliations, and while details vary by source, the broader truth holds: Carthage did not hesitate to use terror publicly when it believed terror would restore control. Even the famous war elephant symbols of Carthaginian military identity could become part of psychological punishment. The image is simple and horrifying: an enormous animal trained to obey turned into a moving instrument of execution. A state that can command an elephant can command a crowd. A crowd that watches such executions learns the lesson without needing it explained. The goal is not only to kill the rebel. The goal is to make rebellion feel impossible. That brings us to Mathos. His story sits like a bruise at the center of Carthage's internal violence. Mathos was not a foreign invader. He was part of the force that Carthage once relied on, a mercenary leader who became a rebel when promises dissolved. When the rebellion finally collapsed in 238 BCE, Carthage did not treat Mathos like a prisoner of war. It treated him like a symbol that needed to be broken in public. Ancient descriptions of his end emphasize procession and humiliation. He was dragged through the streets so the city could watch the state reclaim dominance with its own hands. The execution was not hidden behind palace walls. It was performed before citizens as communal punishment. Carthage wanted the crowd to participate because shared violence creates shared loyalty. If everyone watches, everyone becomes complicit, and complicit crowds are easier to govern. Accounts also describe mass punishments: captives, mutilated men, thrown into pits, bodies denied dignity. Some stories speak of prisoners buried alive together, a punishment designed not only to kill but to terrify. The cruelty is almost architectural. It reshapes the ground itself into a warning. If you rebel, you do not merely die. You disappear beneath the city's feet. This is how states turn justice into spectacle. They perform a moral lesson while doing something morally corrosive. They call it order. They call it stability. They call it necessary. The victims become props in a story where the state is the hero even as it commits acts that would be called monstrous if done by anyone else. And here's the deeper point: Carthage did not invent this logic. Many ancient societies use public execution as theater. What makes Carthage stand out is the combination of fear in religion, fear in labor, and fear in punishment. It is a triangle of control. The gods threaten you. The state threatens you. Poverty threatens you. And if you are conquered, your body becomes the proof that Carthage's threats are not metaphors. Then there is the story Rome told about Regulus. Marcus Atilius Regulus, Roman general, captured during the First Punic War, became a character in a Roman morality play. In later Roman tradition, he was not just defeated. He was tortured in a way designed to brand Carthage as uniquely cruel, enclosed in a spiked box that prevented rest eyelids, cut, forced to stare at the sun, killed through sleep deprivation and agony. Modern historians often suspect this story grew over time, shaped by Roman needs rather than Carthaginian records. Rome had every incentive to paint its great rival as a civilization beyond the pale so that future Roman brutality could be framed as righteous necessity. If the enemy is a monster, then any weapon becomes acceptable. But here is the uncomfortable truth: propaganda works best when it sounds plausible. The Regulus story spread because audiences could imagine Carthage doing it. That means Carthage's reputation, whether deserved or exaggerated, had already been built. Even if the spiked box is legend, the legend reveals something real about the ancient world: how quickly cruelty becomes currency in political storytelling, and how fear can survive longer than any army. Rome's narratives about Carthage were not neutral history. They were part of the war. They fought Carthage with ships and legions, and they fought it with language. They turned the Tophet into a symbol of barbarity. They turned Carthaginian trade into greed. They turned Carthaginian diplomacy into deceit. And in doing so, they prepared the Roman public to accept something that would otherwise be unthinkable: the total destruction of a major Mediterranean civilization. Because Rome did not merely defeat Carthage, Rome erased it. After the Third Punic War, Carthage was burned and dismantled. Survivors were enslaved. The city's political identity was ended. Later stories even claim the ground was salted to prevent rebirth, though that detail is often treated today as legend rather than confirmed practice. What matters is the intention behind the story. Rome wanted Carthage not only dead, but remembered as something that deserved to die. So was Carthage uniquely cruel, or was it singled out by history's loudest winners? Rome had its mass crucifixions. Greece had its exposure of infants. Empires across antiquity treated human beings as resources. Yet the image that clings to Carthage is specific fire earns the Tophet. The bronze god, the drums that drown out cries. It has become the nightmare emblem of Punic religion, and it shaped how later generations justified Carthage's destruction. Maybe that is the darkest lesson. If Carthage truly practiced child sacrifice regularly, then it shows how far a society can go when fear of divine abandonment overrides human empathy. If Carthage did it rarely in panic, then it shows how crisis can unlock horrors that feel impossible in calm times. And if the practice was partly exaggerated by enemies, then it shows how propaganda can weaponize the dead to authorize future slaughter. Either way, Carthage used fear as an instrument of statecraft. Fear of gods, fear of punishment, fear of conquest, fear of becoming the next captive chained to an oar. And fear is effective, but it is also corrosive. It creates obedience, but it also creates enemies who will destroy you the moment they can. Comment below, do you think Carthage's reputation for ritual horror helped protect it, or did it harden the world against it until Rome's final war became inevitable? When a state communicates through terror, it may win short-term obedience, but it also teaches its rivals that negotiation is dangerous. Mercy is naive, and annihilation is safer. Rome feared Carthage, envied Carthage, learned from Carthage, and finally decided the Mediterranean could not hold two giants. In the end, Carthage's greatest weapon, psychological power, may also have become its curse. Because when Rome finally struck, it did not aim to defeat. It aimed to erase. Today, the ruins of Carthage rest along the Tunisian coast. The harbors are quiet water. The stones are warm in the sun. The Tophet, once a place of ash and vow, is now a field of stelae and silence. The city that once shouted devotion into the sky is reduced to fragments you can walk past in an afternoon. But history does not truly silence a place. It changes the way the place speaks. Carthage speaks now through argument and unease, through the debate over urns and inscriptions, through the Roman stories that may or may not be true, but still shaped what the world believed, through the uncomfortable recognition that ancient greatness often required ancient brutality, and that wealth in many civilizations was built on the suffering of people whose names did not survive. This is medieval spirits. We dig up the bones of history to find the truth buried beneath the lies. Carthage is not only a horror story. It is a warning about what happens when a society turns fear into a sacred language. When a state believes survival excuses everything, it begins to treat human life like a tool, then like a symbol, then like ash. If you want more journeys into the darkest corners of the past, like and subscribe. Next time you see ruins, remember that stone is what remains after voices are gone. Somewhere beneath these terraces, beneath these gardens and broken walls, there were people who lived as citizens, as captives, as offerings, as warnings. The empire is gone. The arguments remain. And the most unsettling question still hovers over the coast, like smoke that never fully clears. How much cruelty can a civilization normalize before it convinces itself it is holy?